Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we are joined by Woofers. Woofers previously ran the @map Ethiopia account, which mapped the Tigray War from November 2020 to its conclusion in 2022. And he is a phenomenal account that has a lot of experience covering the civil wars and conflicts in Ethiopia. And we're very glad to have him today. So welcome aboard, Woofers.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So for this episode, kind of from your background, we really want to provide a good episode to a lot of our listeners to talk about the situation in Ethiopia. I think we've had a lot of episodes and a lot of podcasts where we talk about various conflicts and wars around the world, and we kind of always want to highlight the complexity, the nuances, really provide a deep dive. And I think a lot of people, when they talk about very convoluted, complex civil wars, they kind of generally go to Syria with all the different groups and factions that are operating. But one of the key countries that really gets glossed over in the complexity and the issues is Ethiopia, a country that has had a long history of civil war, and it's not necessarily, historically, you can't really put that much focus on that. Let's say when we had episodes talking about the Democratic Republic of Congo and maybe colonialism and all these various different issues. I mean, Ethiopia, one of the few countries that really didn't suffer from colonialism and imperial powers as much as, let's say, other parts of Africa. And yet it has a long history of civil war. And so I'm really happy to have you here. This is an episode I've been really wanting to have because I want to educate myself on Ethiopia. And, before we start that, though, I would like to ask, what kind of got you to focus on Ethiopia? What was the main defining feature that made you build the Map Ethiopia account? Because that was a very helpful tool for the OSINT community to track the latest and greatest in Ethiopia.
Yeah, well, I can't take all the credit for the map. It was actually my buddy who I had known for a while online who started. He came to me in about August, I want to say, of 2020, and he was like, "Hey, man, like it's getting tense in Ethiopia. It's getting, risky. It's looking like there's going to be a war." So he set it up, and I helped him run it. Eventually, it just became me who was running it. He got too busy. Um, But yeah, I mean, Ethiopia is this country that a lot of people in the West don't really think about, but it's on our minds a lot. There's references to it in our culture all the time. And if you live in a city, right, you're going to be coming across Ethiopians. So the more I learned about the country just by mapping it, the more I, you know, found out how much diversity and beauty there was in Ethiopia. And that really got me interested in the country and understanding it and trying to bring that information to an English speaking audience.
I mean, I think we can have this episode, we can make it 10 hours long, and we wouldn't be
Oh
able to
yeah.
cover the entire, even just the post, just the modern history of Ethiopia, the Derg regime and the famines and the various civil wars. So I think let's kind of cover from basically when you started to monitor the situation in Ethiopia and kind of move on, from there. So from your account, you really started you created it to track the situation in the Tigray War, a very violent conflict. And so before we go into the details, please kind of provide an overview for our listeners who might not really grasp and understand the history of Ethiopia in just the last 4 to 5 years. Kind of what's caused the Tigray War, and what was the kind of the main groups involved, and how did it kind of conclude, or is it continuing to going on right now?
Yeah, of course. So, unfortunately, to understand the Tigray War, you have to go before the Tigray War, all the way back to the Derg regime. And during the Ethiopian Civil War, there were several very large rebel groups, and the strongest of which was the Tigray People's Liberation Front. We'll call them the TPLF now. They really led the charge down to Addis Ababa, and they overthrew the Derg, and then they ruled uh, Ethiopia from the fall of the Derg regime to 2018, when Abiy Ahmed swept the power through the Prosperity Party, um, and this was very popular, um, and they were expelled from power. From 2018 to 2020, there was a lot of hope that Ethiopia was going to be um, having a real democracy, having this real federal unity state. Because up to the fall of the TPLF, there were these very brutal protests. They were very viciously put down. Lots of people lost their lives. Then Abiy Ahmed comes around. He says, "I'm going to end the conflict with Eritrea, this border conflict, which is on the border of Ethiopia and Eritrea in Tigray." He does that. He wins Nobel Peace Prize. But all the while, the TPLF were like, "Okay, well, we're going to control our region, and we're still the big kids on the block. You guys can do the rest, what you're doing in the country, but we're going to be in charge here." um and then we come to 2020, and there's regional elections that are meant to be held, and the federal government says, "Hey, it's COVID. You can't have these regional elections." The TPLF says, "No, we're going to hold these elections," and they do, and they, according to them, win overwhelmingly. Um, this tips this big power struggle between Abiy Ahmed and the Tigrayan regional government, led by Debretsion Gebremichael, who is the leader of the TPLF. And eventually some troops start getting moved up north, and the TPLF sees this is going on, and they decide, we're going to launch a preemptive attack. And on about November 4th, November 3rd, they launched this big coordinated offensive throughout mostly eastern Tigray, but throughout all of Tigray, really. And they targeted the northern command of the Ethiopian National Defense Force. Very quickly, they took it over. They also had mass defections from Tigrayans. They seized control of a large fuel depot. They seized control of air defense sites, significant number of tanks and artillery, and the war was on, right? So after this war happened, you had back and forth fighting. You had horrific war crimes in Tigray. You had Amhara militia, which we'll get to later, from, of course, the Amhara region. They're known as Fano. They invaded this region called Western Tigray, ethnically cleansed it. You had the Eritreans occupy parts of northern Tigray, and at the end of the day, you had this interim regional administration be put into power, and that's run by Getachew Reda, who is formerly the TPLF spokesman, but now is the interim regional president.
So, one of the things that you mentioned there that I think is important to highlight, right, before we kind of go to the Tigray issues and the civil war, but as part of that war that happened was kind of Eritrea. And it's a very interesting kind of case study in a way to analyze this conflict because, as you mentioned, during the Derg Civil War, Ethiopia used to have Eritrea as part of its own sovereign country, right? Ethiopia and Eritrea were one country; it was under Ethiopia. And after the Derg Civil War, with the fall of the regime, Eritrea actually fought on the same side as the TPLF and all these other rebel groups against the Derg, regime. And Eritrea gained independence in 1993, and quickly became. I mean, for our listeners to understand, I mean, Eritrea is basically called the North Korea of Africa. I mean, it's a authoritarian regime, no press freedom. It's basically North Korea in Africa. And Eritrea and Ethiopia fought a bloody war between 1998 and 2000, and there was always these very tense relationships between Eritrea and Ethiopia, while the TPLF, kind of in their Zenawi, was in power. Now, fast forward to the Tigray Civil War, where the situation changed drastically, right? Where Eritrea sent troops to fight. At least, again, this is back during the timeframes of 2020 to 2022. Eritrea fought shoulder to shoulder in many aspects with Ethiopian military personnel against TPLF. So the question I have is, in this construct of kind of Ethiopia, was the inclusion of Eritrea military personnel, was that the reason why Ethiopia did that? Was it because it was a necessity, from your opinion? Was that a military necessity, that the only way that Ethiopia would be able to defeat Tigray is that they needed the Eritrean soldiers? Or was this was there another motive that maybe the president of Ethiopia at the time just felt like he wanted to include Eritrea because he knew that the Eritreans had this deep-seated resentment and hatred to the TPLF, and it was just a way to get revenge, and it was just an easier way to kind of get the conflict solved. Like, why do you believe Ethiopia wanted Eritrea involved, and why did Eritrea get involved into this very brutal civil war?
And
I
just quickly, do you think they make odd bedfellows?
uh respond to that second question first. It's important to recognize that actors in the Horn of Africa are very cynical. Um, People do what benefits them, um, and they don't really care about the morals. They do what benefits them. Um, I think the first question, it's a very good question because you'd say, okay, well, what does Eritrea gain from invading here? One, revenge, of course. And then two, war booty. So the Eritreans, they came through and they basically took everything that wasn't bolted down in some of these places. I mean, we had videos of them stealing furniture like wicker chairs, plastic chairs even. They were taking livestock back. They were doing they were basically like locusts, which is quite a crude word to say, but they'd come into areas and they would pick them clean. Um, on the question of if it was a military necessity, I don't know if it was. I think that Ethiopia as a whole could have ultimately defeated the TPLF without um, the EDF. Um, but at the time, I think let's look into context. What happened? You had a fourth of the army defect, right? You had a significant amount of your officer corps defect. And these are the guys with military experience, of course, too, because the guys who were fighting this war against Eritrea in the past, a lot of them were Tigrayans, right? They and they and if you look at the current ENDF, a lot of these guys are Amhara and Oromo now. But even back then, during the 2020 war, the Ethiopian National Defense Forces actually had to do this large purge of Tigrayan personnel. There were actually firefights inside bases abroad between Tigrayans and other ethnicities because the Ethiopian government saw these people as a fifth column, right? Um, so
And just to clarify, when you're saying abroad, you're saying like under when Ethiopian military was acting as peacekeepers. Is that what you're
yes,
referencing? Okay.
yes. Um, so if you look at the Ethiopian military, they might say, okay, we have the military equipment, we have the manpower, but can we defeat these superior, these people who are qualitatively superior to us? And they might have said to Eritrea, we can't. And the Eritreans really started invading about a month into the conflict. This is in December when, or in late November when the Ethiopians were advancing into Tigray because they were actually able to break through the TPLF defenses pretty quickly, um, and actually forced the TPLF, which then reformed its forces into what's called the Tigray Defense Forces, the TDF. They defeated them in a few months. It was very quick. Um, but the Eritreans provided a significant amount of manpower um, that distracted the TPLF, and they just didn't have the forces that could fight everyone. I do think that, like I said, Ethiopia could have won that war, and they ultimately did, but they could have won that first phase, which just would have taken longer.
So with that in mind, so now we're at 2022. I think, as you mentioned, Abiy Ahmed is ethnically Amharan and Oromo, right? And for our listeners who are not familiar, I mean, Ethiopia is composed by dozens of different ethnic groups. A lot of them don't even have not that much in common. They speak different languages, but different. A lot of them might even have different religious backgrounds, etc. It's a very culturally diverse country. Ethiopia. But Abiy Ahmed, he's ethnically Amharan and ethnically Oromo, and specifically Amharan. The militia groups in there were very key in the war in Tigray, right? Tigray, that they were a key
Right.
component. But at the end of the war, and now getting closer to kind of more present day, we've seen intense clashes now between the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Ethiopian military, and now Amharan militias and groups there. So can you kind of explain, and we'll go to more examples where we're seeing that, but we're seeing this historical now with the president that's ethnically Amharan and ethnic Oromo. We're seeing conflict still between now the Ethiopian militaries and these two, different ethnic groups and their militia groups that played a role in to supporting Abiy Ahmed's invasion of Tigray. Now they're fighting Amharan and Oromo even as to this day. And what is the cause of this? What is causing this now the shift in Ethiopia's internal conflict to ethnic groups that played a key role against Tigray?
Right. So during the Tigray War, the the Amhara militias, also known as Fano, they swept into Western Tigray. They ethnically cleansed the area. They settled it, and this was to um, deal with this large territorial dispute that had been lasting since the TPLF era. And during the second phase of the Tigray War, when the TDF broke out of Tigray and they were beelining it towards Addis Ababa, and a lot of people thought it was going to fall. Even I thought, you know, man, they're getting really close. It was because of Fano that um, there wasn't this route of the ENDF. They physically blocked the ENDF from retreating. They even executed ENDF commanders in Waldia who had tried to abandon the city, and they held that city for a month. They critically delayed the TDF's offensive. And I think what happened is that, you know, Addis Ababa got a little bit concerned. They had significant diaspora funding coming in, significant amounts of arms in their possession. And in 2022 and 2023, the Ethiopian government said, all right, well, we need to get rid of these regional militias because the TDF was formed largely from regional militias. Real quick, all regions in Ethiopia had this regional militia, like a national guard, but entirely of one ethnic group. So you can see the problems there. Um, so they said, okay, well, Fano is largely part of or aligned with this regional militia. So we're going to abolish all the regional militias, and we're going to start with the Amara region. Um, the Fano members and a lot of the Amhara political elite saw this quite rightfully, in my opinion, as a selective disarmament, specifically targeting their community. Because they had grown too powerful. Maybe there were fears of a coup, maybe there were fears of them upsetting the political alignment, in other ways. But the goal here was to disarm these groups, and Fano said, no, we're not going to do that. So they were able to take on a significant amount of the Amhara regional forces, um, and magically had this army. And then back in September, August of 2023, they launched this big offensive to try and take over the entire Amhara region. This ultimately failed, but it was very scary for Addis Ababa. And since then, they've been locked in this insurgency to try and put down this group, and they are not able to do that because they have significant popular support.
And so when looking at Ethiopia, they have a population approaching 130 million.
Yes.
Can you try and put this in perspective for why this matters to the United States? Because I think what we've seen recently is this turn inwards for the United States, but if we can just explain why people should care and understand this conflict, I think that would be
Right.
helpful.
Well, like you said, it's a country of 130 million people, a people who are rapidly developing, a people who are eager to learn, eager to buy things, eager to create businesses. It's a major geopolitical player in the Horn of Africa. It's just the only problem it has is it's landlocked, which Ethiopia is hoping to change, mind you. But on top of that, there's a significant diaspora of Ethiopians in the United States. These are people who fled during the Derg, during the famines, and who've migrated afterwards. A lot of these people are have been here, like I said, for decades. They're business owners. There's a very large Ethiopian population, mind you, in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding area. Um, so these are people who, not only do you have Ethiopians in Ethiopia who want to be part of the modern developing world, you have um, the connections to the diaspora in the West, in the United States, and of course in European allies. Um, and we've seen that Ethiopia's saying, well, we want to be part of a development community. And unfortunately for the United States, they have chosen BRICS as that outlet. Um, they are working heavily with the Chinese, who are very interested in the rare earth minerals that are undeveloped in Ethiopia, particularly in the Benishangul-Gumuz region, particularly in areas like just in the south in general as well. And the Chinese are getting in there, the Turks are getting in there, and there's very limited American investment beyond the soft power that they had, which has now evaporated for the most part. So a lot of opportunities are present, but we're at very high risk of losing access to those opportunities.
So, well, first, with kind of what you were mentioning, right? I mean, I think it's historically it's important to highlight Addis Ababa is the center, if I'm not mistaken, of the African Union.
Yes,
The
exactly.
headquarters of the African Union is located in the capital of Ethiopia, right? And you're right. I mean, the Chinese have definitely heavily involved themselves into kind of Ethiopian affairs and to try to be the primary partner. I highlighted the issue of BRICS. And it's kind of an interesting conversation because during, let's say, if you look at post 9/11, right, one of our major partners, if not our most critical and major partner in the Horn of Africa and the global war on terror, was Ethiopia, specifically in the fight against Al Shabaab, the Al
Right,
Qaeda,
Amisom, yeah.
yeah, and AMISOM in Somalia, right? I mean, Ethiopia played a huge, enormous role in fighting and still with the Al Shabaab. I mean, as today this recording, the president of Somalia survived an assassination attempt, a car bombing against that was carried out by Al Shabaab, and it's kind of this, the history of Ethiopia in the from early 2000s into the mid 2010s and 15s. I mean, it was the United States, and we just kind of completely abandoned that and basically handed Ethiopia, for all intents and purposes, to China. And we really haven't done much to kind of address that. And so, do you think that there's really any way that the United States might salvage a relationship with Ethiopia? And or more importantly, is there a desire because Abiy Ahmed, I mean, I think one of the things that we need to highlight is Abiy Ahmed has been kind of somebody who won the Nobel Peace Prize. There was a lot of hope. He's becoming increasingly erratic. And so, does the United States even want to have a relationship with the current Ethiopian government with how erratic Abiy Ahmed has been, not only inside of Ethiopia, but even with a lot of his partners?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, it's multi-part, so I'll say absolutely you can salvage a relationship with Ethiopia. And there's plenty of people who um are willing to have that. Um, Number one, you'd have to restore um US aid, or at least reapproach these contracts, because USAID was a significant effector for aid operations within Ethiopia. We saw what happened in 2023 when there were some aid diversions. So WFP and USA, they shut down operations in Tigray, and at least 1,000 people starved to death. That's how important these people are. And it's a very strong effect when you see, this is a gift from the American people on the box that you're using to survive. That's a very strong impact on someone, especially when you also think about how many of these people have family back in the United States who might be sending them money. Um, I think ultimately what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to look at the, Ethiopian government, talk to them and say, hey, what are you willing to do joint development on? And I think there's real opportunities with mining, um, with manufacturing, specifically manufacturing in the automobile sector and the garment industry, and of course coffee. Um, but you'll have to, you have to see how willing these people are to do business with America when America cut their whole aid budget. What was the second question you had?
Was the question is because Abiy Ahmed is
He's erratic, right?
he's erratic because I mean I think just for context, right? And I'll let you address this, but and we'll kind of continue this conversation after you answer that if he's the preferred partner. But just for our listeners to understand, I mean, again, Tigray, then we have Amara, we have Oromo, the conflict's internal to Ethiopia. And it's almost like every time it's a new one war ends, something else pops up somewhere. But not only internally, but let's look at just regionally, right? And we'll continue this conversation in the podcast. But we have the Blue Nile River Dam. We have tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia and possibilities of land grab there. This and Ethiopia even leveraging its relationship maybe with Puntland or Somaliland, I believe specifically, and kind of undermining the what's the Somali federal government and trying to undermine that there against American interests and what we want in Somalia. But now even as of this recording, there's even conversations and tensions now rising between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and we're hearing chatters again of the possibility, even when both sides fought on the same side against the Tigrays. Now there's conversations that Ethiopia and Eritrea might have a second war against each
Right.
other. So, I mean, is Abiy Ahmed the partner that the United States maybe doesn't want to associate himself with?
Well, I would point to the fact that, Ethiopia under the previous government, under the TPLF, I mean, they were at war. They had multiple insurgencies running themselves. Um, so and in some of the same regions. So when you look at Ethiopia, you say, okay, well, who are our um alternatives? You have Jawar Mohammed. And that's basically it. Jawar Mohammed is an Oromo opposition politician, and he's making some noise right now. But there's no right now, at least at this point in March of 2025, there's no viable alternative for Abiy Ahmed, and he's wildly popular within his party leadership. He was just reelected to his position. And I think we can't guarantee that any other leader would act any differently than what he's doing. And you have to understand, of course, that Ethiopia is a big place. It's an empire. It was built off of an empire. There's always going to be internal struggles to Ethiopia. The question is that government willing to work with the United States? And if they are, I think that, just because of their position, because of their influence, you have to engage with them.
I know, Matthew, we were having conversation. I'll let you go, because of this idea of the kind of the Blue Nile River. But I understand that. Just to kind of before I let Matthew ask that, I just feel like there needs to be a serious conversation when we're talking about Ethiopia and the power structure. That some of the actions that Abiy Ahmed has done, I do believe, kind of breaks some of the precedents that we've historically seen with Ethiopia. But maybe one of the conversations we can kind of expand upon. Matthew, go ahead with the Blue Nile River.
Yeah, so one of my biggest questions in looking at the policy of Ethiopia is this idea of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And I'm not sure how much the United States is engaging on this. And I do think we need to have a conversation about how the United States can apply soft power and have these discussions. But when they build this dam, it's going to cause problems, or it is causing problems uh, with Sudan, and that flow of water goes all the way up to Egypt and the Nile Delta. So, how do you think this plays into internal politics, and how do you think this plays into external and international relations?
Right. Well, obviously the GERD is a very big deal for Egypt and a very big deal for Sudan, although it's mostly Egypt. Um, and this is Ethiopia saying, "Hey, we're a big kid on the block. This is our water. We do with it what we want." And Egypt, especially now, they're not really in a position to do anything about it. Especially with the dam essentially being complete at this point. Um, the the Egyptians are going to constantly have this as a massive chip on their shoulder, right? Because negotiations for water sharing rights failed. The Ethiopians have put a bunch of military defenses around the site. They have significant garrisons nearby. So even if um, the Egyptians launched some military attack on the dam, which they'd have to seize the dam if they wanted to disrupt the flow. They'd have to actually physically take the dam. It's so big you can't bomb it. Even if they were able to take over the dam temporarily, they couldn't hold it. Certainly not for the months or years needed, and certainly not with Sudan in a civil war. But this is Ethiopia saying, "Hey, we are self-sufficient. Um, we are." I mean, to put this in perspective, I mean, if you think about the name of the GERD, it's the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It's a symbol of pride. This is a monument to developing Ethiopia that is claiming its rightful place as a regional powerhouse in its eyes, of course. So really, it's just this big trophy they can push around and say, "Hey, look, I'm a big deal. This is my water. What are you going to do about it? I have a negotiating tool with you. You know, I can either starve you out, I can give you your water, or I can flood your entire country."
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it seems like at this point, all the chips are in Ethiopia's pocket. Um,
But actually, can I ask a question though, Woofers? Because I think this kind of ties into. I mean, it's kind of this interesting dynamic based on that in this dam played a lot of a role in various conflicts that we're seeing there, right? Because if during the Sudanese civil war, when the coup was launched by the RSF, by how many, Egyptian soldiers were caught in Sudan, with the clear understanding that the reason why these Egyptian soldiers were there was to focus on Ethiopia. We had reports that Egypt and Sudan were supporting the TPLF against Abiy Ahmed, kind of during the Civil War. And so I do believe that the GERD, it kind of did provide this level of instability, way much more so than we're willing to acknowledge. And to be honest, though, I think one of the conversations that we need to have is, if the United States had to pick and choose between Ethiopia and Egypt, I hate to say it, it's just because of the relationship with Israel. Egypt will always come on top, way more so than Ethiopia. But the question is, that's where maybe Ethiopia, even to their mind, that's why they kind of do not view the United States anymore as their preferred partner. Maybe they might go to China for more backing, specifically because of this. If I'm not mistaken, the GERD, was it funded and assisted by Chinese development, or if I'm mistaken on that?
I believe it was.
Yeah, but do you think that the United States, and I guess the question is though, has there been any development, any negotiations between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan? I mean, obviously Sudan and the civil war that they're at, that we talked about in a previous episode, but any movement between Egypt and Ethiopia from the diplomatic front is basically pretty much dead.
Well, they've had multiple rounds of negotiations, and all of them didn't really produce a desirable result. I think that we're at a point where only diplomacy can work when you're talking about the GERD, but we're also at a point where, Ethiopia is pretty confident in saying, "Hey, we have all the cards here. Like, we're not going to flood you. We're not going to starve you of, of water, but like this is ours." Um, the GERD is going to be providing a significant amount of electricity to Ethiopia. Some of it they will export for money. Um, so they're looking at this as a national resource, and they feel no reason to um, submit to Egyptian demands when Egypt can't really do anything. I mean, Egypt can support. Let me backtrack on that. Egypt can support militant groups, like you said, and we did see some limited support. I couldn't point to individual weapons, but there was support. Um, they can buddy up with the Somalian government. They can buddy up with the Eritreans, But beyond an actual like a war, the Egyptians don't really have many diplomatic levers here.
So, in speaking about resources, and this is one of the things that you mentioned, so we have seen the Chinese go after gold in specifically West Africa, because that can normally be done on a smaller scale. But at the same time, like there's platinum, there are gemstones, and significant deposits of iron ore. So how do you see that playing into A, the current conflict, and B, uh, international relations?
Well, luckily for Ethiopia, a lot of the areas where uh, mining is taking place haven't been affected by conflict directly, because there's interest on all sides to keep these mines open. Um, local groups might get some revenue. The government, of course, gets revenue. These international uh, corporations get revenue. What I will say, an area to watch is going to be the Somali region, and that's, I think, an area where you could see attacks on mining companies and oil and gas companies, because you have this one group called the Ogaden National Liberation Front, which has recently expressed anger at the current government for basically sidelining them politically, which they see as a violation of their peace agreement. And they have directly threatened, about a week ago, they directly threatened oil and gas companies in the Somali region, um, who are who they say are robbing the Somali people. Um, so luckily we haven't seen these direct attacks on the mines, on their workers, on the infrastructure, but there could be secondary effects. So, for example, if you have a road that's shut down because there's constant fighting, if you have a fuel shortage, if there's if a road is physically destroyed, such as what happened in Tigray and Amhara when they were blowing up bridges, for example, that could impact things. But outside of the Somali region, I really don't anticipate at this time that the mineral trade will be affected.
I mean, I think it's also important, if I'm mistaken, the Ugandan insurgency. I mean, that has been ongoing for decades.
Yeah,
That's
but
been a persistent,
at
yeah,
a very low level.
low
Uh,
level. Okay.
yeah, very low level. I mean, they've been around for decades, and quite famously, about a decade and a half ago, they did target a camp of Chinese and Ethiopian workers, killing I think about 40 of them. This was a big deal. So there is precedent for this group doing this in the past. Um, but yeah, like I said, yeah, they've been around for a while.
Yeah, I think it's just concerning because we've seen and we've covered so many conflicts where resources are really at the heart of it. And I think at the end of the day, like it's pretty obvious to me that the Chinese are trying to establish these relationships so that they can exploit those natural resources. And it it's concerning because we've seen how they applied this in Western Africa and with a country as large as Ethiopia. If they can establish a footprint there and the United States is not focusing on this, and if the people in the United States don't really understand the need to exert some of that soft power and support Ethiopia, China could end up establishing themselves and walking away with uh, quite a bit of the natural resources that Ethiopia has. And that to me is worrisome.
Right. And unfortunately, for a lot of these areas that are already being developed, the opportunity's already been lost because it takes decades to set up some of these mines. Um, and the Chinese have proven to be a willing partner for a lot of these things. Just like in a lot of Africa, they've helped build up a lot of the infrastructure there. Uh, Not always to the best of economical terms, but Ethiopia the Ethiopians see the Chinese as a reliable business partner.
Well, and that's the thing. Like in the background, they're taking these steps to build the mines to extract things like
Right,
tantalum. But in the meantime, they're also exploiting like these, gold mines and platinum, which is a bit easier to exploit, and you can do it on a smaller scale. So yeah,
right.
it's definitely concerning, and it seems like something that is flying under the radar of the United States.
And there's a lot
So
of anti-Western sentiment in Ethiopia, or just casual conspiracy theories. Um, there's a lot of belief uh by pro-government people back during the Tigray War that secretly the West was backing the TPLF, which there was no evidence of. But that caught a lot of traction. There were government organized protests against um, news organizations like Reuters, the AP, the BBC for allegedly lying about Ethiopian war crimes or the condition of the military there. Um, and then, of course, Ethiopia is looking at their per- their prospective partners right after the USA cuts. So, you had the Chinese who are building infrastructure and the Americans who are pulling aid and directly leading to probably tens of thousands of deaths.
yeah,
So
and it's not just USAID, it's also things like PEPFAR.
Right,
Um,
right, which for one of the most successful programs in medical history, um, just losing that is catastrophic, and it's put a lot of people out of work as well.
and it's also very frustrating that the United States, for better or for worse, gets lumped in with, France and all of that history. And
Right.
again, that goes back more to Western Africa, but I think that is still effective propaganda across the continent.
Yeah, I mean, well, also remember that for a while the Ethiopians were in the Soviet sphere of influence, right? So there is that framing of America as part of the imperialist West, which, many people wouldn't disagree with in certain economic actions. Uh, but the Ethiopians, I think compared to many other Africans, they're quite warm towards the American people in general and American assistance. So, like I said before, there's opportunities there still, but with the current actions taken in the past 3 months here, or 2.5 months here, um, there's going to be very low trust.
So, Wilbur, if there's one question I just feel like I do have to ask related to kind of Ethiopia, and it's there's this Ethiopia Somaliland memorandum of understanding, I believe it was, that was signed in 2024. Um, do you believe, because again, Ethiopia has been a major player in the Somali civil war. I mean, all the way back in 2006, back when the Islamic Court Union looked like they were going to seize complete power. Ethiopia invaded with the backing of the Bush administration. That kind of started the Al Shabaab insurgency. Ethiopia has always played a major role in the peacekeeping operations in Somalia. And then in 2024, Ethiopia signed this memorandum of understanding with kind of the breakaway region of Somaliland. And almost to the point of there's this idea, was Ethiopia going to recognize Somaliland's independence? And so, do you believe that deal, from 2024 today, has there been any real updates to that? Has there been really any chance to kind of solidify that? Or was that Abiy Ahmed trying to kind of rattle the African Union, maybe rattle the East, the Horn of Africa or the international community, to try to see if he can get more concessions internationally and more support? Where do you view the Ethiopia Somaliland MOU in that spectrum?
Well, I would say that the Ethiopian government, Abiy Ahmed in particular, was testing the waters to see what the international reaction was, especially as we approached a period in time where it might be okay to take territory by force. Um, this idea of, okay, well, Ethiopian economic survival really relies upon having a port of its own, that it can develop by itself without all these taxes. And there's only two options. There's Eritrea and there's Somalia. And in this case, the Somaliland region of Somalia. I don't think it was an attempt to rattle anyone. I think at the most, it was him testing the waters to see what the reaction was, how regional players would react, um, and specifically, um, how powerful the Eritreans and Somalians are, right? The Ethiopians um, haven't made any progress in the past year on the MOU. It seems like it's stagnated. The Turks came in, they helped mediate between the Ethiopians and the Somalians, and there have been some communications there. But we haven't seen any progress in at least the last quarter. Just meetings and discussions, but nothing else signed. So I think we're gonna have for the next at least year here, just the same and the same. Unless there is war with Eritrea. And if there's a war with Eritrea, then they'll go after a port. But I don't think that there's gonna be any forcible taking of any port in Somalia. And I think that if there is a resolution, there will be a revenue sharing deal or a port deal similar to what happens with Djibouti, but potentially in more favorable terms for the Ethiopians.
It's funny that you were mentioning the Turks because when the whole Ethiopia Somaliland kind of negotiations and MOU was signed, we saw the Egyptians almost at the same time also announcing partnerships with Somalia as well, and it's kind of this interesting dynamic, even because a lot of times we look at the big players, China, Russia, and then we look at Turkey, maybe the Emiratis, the Saudis, but the Egyptians have also been very involved in the Horn of Africa, and it looks like as a direct threat to Ethiopia, or at least a challenge. Let me say that challenge Ethiopia's position in the Horn of Africa. But to your last point, what do you think is the likelihood in this? Because again, tensions are rising right now between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Do you believe a second war, Ethiopian-Eritrean war, is on the horizon?
I would not discount it as a possibility. I so what happened in February is um the Eritreans got really, really mad about an op-ed in, I think it was Al Jazeera. Uh Not quite sure if that's correct, but basically it was by a former president, and it was talking about how um Eritrea is really the root of a lot of instability in the Horn of Africa. They pointed to their involvement in Sudan. They pointed to their involvement in, of course, the Tigray War. To the fact that Eritrea is still occupying parts of Ethiopia right now. They never left the Arab area and an area near Rama in northern Tigray. And the Eritreans got really mad about this, and they got really angry because they saw this as increased rhetoric, potentially for combat, right? So they did this mobilization. They called up their reservists, and that was just to check and see who's around, right? See, okay, how many guys do we have available? And then we've had some reports of military equipment being removed from depots and moved towards the border. I haven't seen any evidence of that. I'm looking for more satellite imagery of this. Um, I have seen some Ethiopians raising concerns about this, but the imagery that they're using is at least a year old and sometimes shows Eritrean military positions that have existed for a decade or more. Um, to that end, though, what I will note is that the TPLF, the people who, went to war against Eritrea, both previously and just a few years ago, have recently been reaching out to the Eritreans, specifically the Debretsion faction of the TPLF, which just launched a coup in the Tigray region and expelled the regional administration. Um, there's been some very strong allegations that he has reached out to the Eritreans. To what end, it's unknown right now. But, you know, this could serve as an incubator for a future conflict. The Ethiopians are looking at a Tigray which has expelled its interim administration after the Tigray War. So you have the old guard now back in power, and potentially teaming up with the Eritreans. And that would be plenty reason enough for a military intervention in the region again. If that happens, there's of course a possibility for another war with Eritrea. But like I said at the beginning of the podcast, all players in the Horn of Africa are extreme cynics. So anything is possible.
Well, and I think there really needs to be more focus on the Horn, and honestly, Africa in general. I think we can talk about the uh, U.S. presence at Camp Lemonade, Camp Simba. The United States has a footprint here, and it's not something that is top of mind for a lot of people. So we would love to have you back at some point to kind of expand on the situation in Somalia, Kenya. We could probably talk about DRC, Uganda. Like there's plenty of stuff to discuss at this point. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been the bottom line up front. If you guys have any final thoughts, by all means, but if not, I think this is a good place to wrap up.
No, I think this was a great episode, Woofers. I really appreciate your expertise in Ethiopia. You did excellent work, and I think a lot of people might recognize you from, like, let's say, the OG OSINT accounts. Your work on Ethiopia, Syria is gold tier, and definitely an influence on a lot of people. So if you guys want to follow, make sure you follow Woofers on X, and make sure you track all of his accounts and information, because it is phenomenal. But Woofers, thank you very much.
Thank you,
And
man.
I was saying this before, you are one of the people that, we had up on the Twitter deck in the security operations center. So yeah, great work and definitely appreciated. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right, thank you, man. Pleasure.
All right, this has been the bottom line up front, and we will speak to you next week.